I wonder if any of you are wondering, you're like, what the heck does she have now? I have some PS4 games. Well, what does that have to do with anything? Why do I have PS4 games? Last time I had the cup of coffee. This time I have PS4 games. Well, why? We're going to talk about research methods. We're going to talk about how psychologists, how people in the psychology profession answer research questions. And specifically, I'm going to use the example of how do things like this, okay, PS4 game, Call of Duty Black Ops, how do things like this affect kids? Does playing violent video games? Now, I know we would argue about how violent is violent and whether that's really violent or not, but that's beyond the point. How does playing video games with violence affect kids? Does it make kids behave more aggressively? That's one of the big questions in psychological research right now. In developmental psych specifically, that's one of the questions. There's a lot more violence on TV and in video games and in movies than there used to be. So how does this affect kids? Okay, so take that question. How would you go about answering it? This is research methods. Any question that people in psychology-related fields have, how do you go about answering the question? How do you go about designing an experiment or designing a method of answering it? That's what research methods is. Okay, I'm going to do 3 sections. First of all, talk about different ways to collect data. Second of all, talk about designing experiments. Then last, in terms of research methods, talk about research ethics. Finally, tangential to research methods, I want to talk about just a little bit about basic statistics and how to analyze data. So, let's go for it. First of all, collecting data. There are a number of different ways people can go about collecting data. The first one is case studies. Case studies are when you collect a lot of data from an individual or small group. When you're talking about video games and violence, you may want to take a small group. Like, for instance, somebody may look at it with the perspective of school shooters and look at their history and find out if they have a history of playing violent video games. Okay, that's a way to do it. The question may not be violent video games in that case, but you may do a case study of a school shooter. What's the advantage of that? An advantage would be that you are collecting a lot of depth, a lot of information about that individual or small group. So the advantage is the depth of information. You're going to have written stuff, written diaries, written interview notes, maybe physical data like health data. You're going to have a lot of different stuff on that individual or small group. The big disadvantage of case studies is that it does not provide generalizability. You can collect all the information you want about that school shooter, but it doesn't tell you in general, does playing violent video games make you more aggressive? It doesn't answer the question for the general populace. And that's the problem. It's the generalizability, the being able to expand it to everyday people. That's the problem with case studies. So, what are some other options? Well, there's naturalistic observation. Naturalistic observation is observing people typically in their everyday environment. So if I wanted to look at video games and violence, I would go into people's houses and watch them play video games. I might look at my kids playing video games and observe them and note each word they said and their movements and whether they ate or drank anything while they were playing, who they were talking to, do all these detailed notes. That's naturalistic observation. Another kind of study. If I wanted to do a study on behaviors of social media, I might watch people as they're getting onto social media. If I wanted to do studies of behavior of people in bars, I would go to a bar and look at people in bars. That's naturalistic observation. So, advantages, disadvantages. The advantages of naturalistic observation are that you get people in their actual environment and you're getting real behavior. You're not just getting a report of behavior, you're getting real behavior. The disadvantage is you get what you get. I could be looking at my kids playing video games and they could be, none of their friends could be on, so they could be playing with somebody they don't know, or they could be just playing by themselves. And they could have very different actions playing by themselves than playing with their friends. So you get what you get is the biggest disadvantage. The experimenter has little control over the environment or what they get. So the advantage, you get real behavior. The disadvantage is you get what you get. So another option and another disadvantage of naturalistic observation is that it takes a long time. I can observe people playing video games and I'm only observing 1 or 2 people. So that's another disadvantage. Well, how do you combat that? One way is to do surveys. Surveys are when you ask questions to a bunch of people. It can be a paper and pencil survey. It can be a phone survey. It can be an internet survey. Typically paper and pencil, or now internet surveys, where you send it to a bunch of people and you get a bunch of responses. I could do that. Back to the questions of video games and aggression. I could go to my children's high school and survey hundreds of people, hundreds of students. Give them a survey. How many hours do you play video games each week? Which video games do you play? Have you ever gotten in trouble? Have you ever gotten into a fight? How many fights have you gotten into in your life? Get a bunch of behaviors that I would consider aggressive and ask them if they've ever done it. I could do that. And I could get a lot of data really quickly. So an advantage of surveys are that you can get data from a lot of people. It's quick and cheap. Big advantages. However, there's a big disadvantage too. And that's the fact that it's self-report. You are asking people to report on their own behavior. You're asking teenagers, in this case, what video games they play and how often they play video games. Can anybody see the problem with that? Well, 2 major problems. One is people lie. So people purposely lie. You can ask people, have you smoked in the past year? And they may or may not tell you the truth. You can ask people how many hours a week they spend on social media. They may or may not tell you the truth. So people can purposely lie, and people can give false information not because they really believe it. In other words, faulty memories. When you're asking people to report something, they're reporting their memory of it. And people's memories are not necessarily correct. So that's the disadvantage of self-report data. So advantage of surveys, quick, cheap, lots of people. Disadvantage, self-report. The last option for collecting data is archival data. It's using data that's already there. So I could look at, get on and look at how many people are logged on to a certain video game and get that data. I could look at Uniform Crime Report and see how many crimes were committed in different areas and what the video game sales were. So I can use data that's already there. There's a lot of different options with archival data. There's using data that's already there and putting it together. Like, if I want to get video game sales in the Columbus area and crime rate in the Columbus area compared to video game sales in Detroit and the crime rate in Detroit, I can do that. That might be a way to use archival data to get at this question. Or you can look at previous studies and analyze data from the previous studies in a different way. That's use of archival data. Advantage, you don't have to collect it. Disadvantage, you are beholden to whatever the first researcher collected, for good, bad, or indifferent. You get what you get, in a sense. So that's a disadvantage. So those are the ways to collect data. Let's move on. There are some general types of research. And we're going to talk about how to design studies. With that, talk about general types of research. There's, first of all, longitudinal versus cross-sectional. If you're looking at change over time, then you can do it one of two ways. You can do a longitudinal study, which is getting people at a certain time and then getting the same people later on. So let's say I wanted to look at the difference between 10-year-olds and 15-year-olds in terms of video game play. I could get a group of people when they're 10 and get their names and addresses, and then get the same group of people when they're 15 and follow them up. That would be longitudinal. Or I could get a bunch of 10-year-olds and 15-year-olds at the same time and collect data on playing video games. That would be cross-sectional. Longitudinal, same people at different times. Cross-sectional, people of different ages at the same time. So what are the advantages and disadvantages? Cross-sectional is a lot quicker. You don't have to wait the 5 years. A lot quicker and therefore cheaper. However, the disadvantage of cross-sectional is that you have what's called cohort effects. Longitudinal has the same people. So you can look at you can really get at change over time. You can really get at what happens over time. Cross-sectional, different people have different experiences. If you're looking at video game play in 20-year-olds versus 10-year-olds, well, the 20-year-olds have had more life experience and more exposure. If you're looking at, let's take it a step farther. If you're looking at texting in 20-year-olds compared to 40-year-olds, they have totally different life experiences. They have totally different familiarity with cell phones and technology. So that's cohort effects. They're not the same people. If you were to get 20-year-olds today and then to ask them about texting, and then the same people 20 years from now, you could really get a better idea of change over time. So that's longitudinal versus cross-sectional. Longitudinal is slow and it takes time, but you get the same people. Cross-sectional, it's quick, but you have cohort effects. Before we exit this, another disadvantage of longitudinal is people dropping out. So even though your goal is to get the same people, you don't always get the same people. And the people that you don't get are the most transient ones. So that's longitudinal versus cross-sectional. The next thing is correlational versus experimental research. Correlational research is collecting two different pieces of data and seeing how that data is related. So for instance, if I, as a college, wanted to know if ACT score and GPA are related, I could collect both pieces of data and do an analysis to see if they're related. If I wanted to see if video game play and aggression are related, I could get a bunch of people and collect data on video game play and aggression and see if the two are related. That would be correlational. An experimental study would be, I'm actually manipulating something. So and I'm looking at cause and effect. Does playing video games cause you to behave more aggressively? You're attempting to answer that question. Well, how do you do that? You do that through a bunch of things. You do that through starting out with a hypothesis. My hypothesis might be playing more violent video games causes people to behave more aggressively. More increased video game use, increased aggressiveness. That might be my hypothesis. A hypothesis is a specific prediction. So how do I do that? I operationalize my variables. What does that mean? And we're going to get into some stuff that you guys may have heard about when you were in middle school, maybe doing a science fair. So let's get into this. Operationalizing, what's a variable? A variable is something that you measure. A variable might be name of video game. Okay. Which video game did you play? That would be a variable. Your gender. That might be a variable. Hours of video game play. That might be a variable. Number of aggressive acts. That might be a variable. Something that you measure. Now, it doesn't have to be a numerical measurement. It can be something like gender, where you're putting a label on somebody. You're putting them in a group. But it's think of having a spreadsheet and having each person and a piece of data about each person. That would be a variable. It's something that some piece of data you collect. And operationalizing means, okay, I want to look at video game play. How am I going to operationalize that? I'm going to collect the name of the video game and the hours of play. That's basically how you do it. Okay. Now, what do we do from there? Well, we look at this idea of you can't collect data from everybody. So what you want to do is you want to collect data from a sample, but the sample needs to be what's called representative, which means it needs to reflect the group that you want to make a conclusion about. Now, what that usually means is that you need to use what's called random selection, where you get, like if I wanted to figure out in my kid's high school, what's the average number of hours of video game play a week, I could get the names of every kid in the high school and randomly pick a certain number of kids. That would be random selection. The reason I would do that is that I would hope I would get what's called a representative sample. I would hope I would get a sample that roughly looked like that high school. I would get kids that were high academic, kids that were lower academic, and so on and so forth. Kids that were athletes, kids that were not athletes. I would get a sample that reflected the high school. That's what representativeness means. And that's important. That's why you use things like random assignment. So, what do we do here? Experimental and control group. Experimental group is the group that actually gets the treatment, and control group does not. So if I say, does playing a violent video game make you more aggressive? The experimental group would get the violent video game, and the control group would not. If I say, does a drug reduce blood pressure? The experimental group would get the drug, and the control group would not. So that's experimental versus control group. Control group gets business as usual. They get nothing special. We have blind and double-blind studies. Blind studies mean that the people in the experiment don't know which group they're in. Double-blind studies mean that not only do the people in the experiment not know which group they're in, the people working with them don't know which group they're in. Why is this important? Well, think about this. If you were doing a study on video games and aggression, and you said, we're going to see how aggressive you are. Well, you're in the group that had the violent video game, so we're expecting you to be aggressive. You're not going to say we're expecting you to be aggressive, but you're going to say, oh, you're in the violent video game group. Or if you're doing a test to see if a drug affects blood pressure, you're getting the real drug. And, oh, you're getting a placebo. You're not going to tell them which group they're in. That's why blind studies are important. It's also sometimes important to have a double-blind study because unintentionally, if the person working with them knows that they got the real drug, they're going to expect them to behave differently. So that's why that's important. Okay, so what do we have next? Blind and double-blind studies, independent and dependent variables. Okay, independent variable is the predictor. Dependent variable is the outcome. So independent variable might be group. Independent variable is, you've probably heard it as the thing that the experimenter controls. So if you're looking at different video games and how much aggression, it would be the video game you play. If you were doing an experiment with drugs, then it would be whether you get the placebo or the real drug. That would be the independent variable. The dependent variable would be blood pressure or aggression or whatever you're measuring, the outcome. So the independent is the predictor, the dependent is the outcome. There's also what's called control variables, which are things that you hold constant. So if I were doing my experiment with different video games, then my control variable might be the gaming system, the chair, the room, the lighting. Those are the kind of things that would be my control variables. So that's independent, dependent, and control variables. Okay. So what else do we have here? We have reliability and validity. Okay. Reliability and validity when it comes to research. If a measurement is reliable, that means you can count on it. So if I'm going to measure it again and again and again and again, I'm going to get similar results. That's what it means to be reliable. Valid means I'm measuring what I say I'm measuring. So if I want to measure aggression, okay, and I say I'm going to measure how many calories you had in the past day, that's not aggression. That's not aggression at all. That's not a valid measurement of aggression, because what do calories eaten have to do with aggression? But if I say, I want to get a measurement of aggression and I measure decibels of your voice, I'm getting closer. I'm getting closer. Not excellent, but I'm getting closer. Things like this. If I want to measure aggression, and I look at how many fights somebody's gotten in the past year, I'm getting even closer. So valid means I'm measuring what I'm setting out to measure. If I want to measure physical fitness, a really valid measure of physical fitness might be a combination measure of how long it takes you to go a mile, your BMI, your blood pressure, your cholesterol level, and put them all together and make some kind of equation. That would be a really comprehensive, good, valid measure of physical fitness. So that's validity. Okay, so we talked about how to collect data. We talked about different ways to design an experiment. Now let's talk about research ethics. What are some things to do and not do? Well, we have informed consent, confidentiality, deception. Informed consent. People need to know what they're getting into. One of the things when you're doing research is that before people actually do a study, you need to tell them what they're doing and basically tell them that it's voluntary and give them the choice. That's informed consent. And that's pretty much a given. There are some people that have trouble giving informed consent, children or people with cognitive issues. And in that case, you get informed consent from their legal guardian. So informed consent, you need to tell people what's going on and they have to, with all the information, decide whether to do it or not. The next thing is deception. Deception is either outright lying or deceiving subjects in an experiment. You are basically either purposely lying or letting them believe something that is not true. A famous example of deception in an experiment was Milgram's shock experiment. He told people that they were doing an experiment on teaching and learning, when they were really doing an experiment on obedience to authority. Now, are you allowed to lie to people? Well, the answer is yes, but. I think that's pretty much it. The answer is yes, but. Yes, you are allowed to deceive. However, it must be approved, and to be approved, you have to show that it is necessary in order to get valid data. In other words, the people would literally respond differently if they knew what the experiment was really about. So it is necessary to get valid data, and there's going to be little to no harm. So it's not going to hurt anybody by doing it, or at least the minor hurt that it's going to cause, the information that you gain is going to be more than worth it. So the harm to subjects. And you have to debrief afterwards. You have to afterwards sit them down and let them know what the experiment was really about. So those are the rules on deception. It's really regulated and there has to be kind of a really good reason for it. And that's something that definitely has to go through what's called an IRB board or institutional review board. The last thing about research ethics is what's called confidentiality. Confidentiality is this idea of when you are getting information from a person, you can't give out their personal information. I can't say, oh, so-and-so said that they smoke 20 cigarettes a day. Or so-and-so said that he plays 20 hours of video games a week. I can't do that. Well, I can, but it's not ethical. to do that. There are only 2 conditions in which you're allowed to break confidentiality. Really. There are only 2 conditions in which you're allowed to give out somebody's individual data. The first is if they give you permission. Okay, fine. If they say that you can do it, you can do it. If you get their permission. I did that when I did research with standardized test scores. I was able to get individual kids' test data because I got permission from their parents. Okay, makes sense. The second reason why you would be able to break confidentiality is if there is a chance of harm. If somebody is a threat to themselves or others. Let me give you an example. I used to work for the Ohio Department of Ed on the 9th grade proficiency tests, and they had what was called alerts, which is if somebody on the writing test talked about abuse, neglect, criminal activity, then they flagged it and gave it to us. We would call the school counselor and tell them what the kid said. We would tell them that so-and-so said this. We would break confidentiality. Why? If somebody is saying something that means harm for them or others, then we are duty bound to try to do something to help. If somebody says they're contemplating suicide, you can't just stand around and let that happen. You got to tell somebody and try to get that person help. If somebody says, I'm thinking of getting a gun and shooting up the school, well, by golly, you're going to call that school and tell them what this person said so they can stop it. If somebody says, I'm going to rob a store, same thing. So that's the issue. If there is if somebody is a threat to themselves or others, then you need to do something to get help. And one of the things, educators are legally bound to do that. So that's a reason why you might break confidentiality. Those are research ethics. The last thing I wanted to talk about when it comes to the general research methods category is a 2-minute diatribe, 2-minute segue into statistical analysis with 3 things specifically. One is central tendency. I want to refresh you on mean, median, and mode. This is something you probably had way back when. Mean is an average. You add up all the numbers, you divide by how many you have. Median, 50th percentile, half above, half below. Mode, most common. It's a way to look at what is a typical score. There's also the idea of variability, and that is how spread out the numbers are. If you take a test and everybody got a B versus the scores are all over the place, that's another way to measure it. So that's kind of just general descriptive stuff. There's also what's called a correlation, or specifically if you're looking at a number, a correlation coefficient. This is a number between -1 and +1. And it tells you a linear relationship. By linear, I mean like if one goes up, the other goes up. If one goes up, the other goes down. A -1 would be a perfect negative linear relationship. As one goes up, the other goes down perfectly. A +1 would be a perfect positive linear relationship. As one goes up, the other goes up perfectly. I like to say positive means they're in sync, they're positive. They're going the same direction. Negative means they clash. They're going in opposite directions. In reality, there's a lot of stuff that's near 0, which means there's little to no relationship. If you look at something like height and IQ, it would be almost 0, little to no relationship. If you look at something like age and texting, it would be negative. As you get older, you text less. As age goes up, texting goes down. If you look at GPA and IQ, the higher your IQ, tend to be the higher your GPA, or ACT score and GPA. The higher your ACT score, typically the higher your GPA. So that's correlations. The last thing I wanted to touch on is this idea of statistical significance. And that's when you look at journal articles, they're going to tell you that the difference is statistically significant, or the relationship is, there's a significant relationship. That means it's beyond chance. Specifically, they're going to say it was significant, then they're going to say P is less than 0.05 or P is less than 0.01. That means the chance of getting it is less than 5%, that 0.05, or the chance of getting that is less than 1%. That means, for instance, if you say seniors text significantly less than college students, that means the mean difference, the chance that those means were the same, is less than 5%. That's what that's telling you. That difference is beyond chance. It's not just random. That's what significant means. It's kind of like if you go into a courtroom and you presume somebody's innocent, you have evidence. And if the chance that they're innocent is less than a certain amount, in statistical terms, it's usually 5% for social science. If the chance that they're innocent is less than that, then you declare them guilty. That's what we're talking about when we talk about statistical significance. Think about it. If you want to do some research on it, fine. Believe me, statistical significance is something that is not easy to understand. I've taught stats for a number of years, and it's not something that's easy. So it's not something that I need you to understand to a large extent. If you have any questions, feel free. If you have any questions about any of this at all, feel free.